London, the Victorian age, a time and a place of contrasts, a bustling metropolis of refinement and progress, shadowed by gaslit alleys, poverty, and crime. This was an era when police work was still in its early stages, and forensic science, well, basically non-existent. And that creates a fertile ground for mysteries that would both horrify and fascinate the public. You might have immediately thought of the notorious figure Jack the Ripper, that killer of 1888. Yet as infamous as the Ripper became, he was hardly the only unknown perpetrator to prowl London's foggy streets, and due to how much attention he gets, the other cases seem to go by the wayside. In the decades before and after the Ripper's spree, the city witnessed a string of other unsolved crimes that equally perplexed contemporaries and later historians. And it is these cases that captured Victorian imaginations, filled newspaper columns, and in some instances even influenced literature and popular culture. And so today, getting away from the Ripper phenomenon, which of course is one we've already made videos on, we're going to talk about the other unsolved crimes of Victorian London. There's plenty of them. We're going to go into a few of them in quite a bit of detail. So if you'll come with me back into those dirty, smoke-filled and coal-stained alleys, we might find some unsavory figures. But first let me welcome you to the channel. It's in good manners that I do so. Once again, we are here ad-free, just like all the other videos, because we are supported by the patrons, YouTube members, the occasional donation, and the merch store. That helps us keep everything interruption-free, because we all hate those kind of interruptions, and we've quite rightly had enough of them, so you don't need to get them here. A veritable sanctuary away from the ads, we might say. But if you want to support us in another way, you're already doing it by just enjoying your time on this channel. You can spread the word too. Tell your friends, tell your enemies, and just do the like, comment, subscribe, hype button thing. That's good enough for us. Anyway, now I've said it once, that's that out of the way, and we won't say anything more about it. Let's get on with the murderers and criminals, Let's begin the first tale on a spring morning in 1838. So we're going back pretty early. London awoke to some bad news. It was a murder, so savage and frankly puzzling that it would linger in the public memory for generations. Poor Eliza Grimwood. Remember that name. A 26-year-old woman of beauty and, reputedly, a high-class courtesan. She was found brutally slain in her home in the early hours of May 26, 1838. Her horrific death, and the failure to bring her killer to justice, became one of the most famous unsolved crimes of early Victorian London. It would even echo in literature, providing inspiration for Charles Dickens's depiction of Nancy's murder in Oliver Twist. Everything gets inspiration from somewhere, for better or worse. To the Victorians, the Grimwood case was a byword for horror. Decades later, when the Jack the Ripper murders started in 1888, newspapers reminded readers that the Whitechapel atrocities were, quote, as ghastly as the Grimwood murderer, a testament to how deeply this 1838 crime had impressed itself on the public conscience. But a little bit more about Eliza Grimwood now. She lived on Waterloo Road, 12 Wellington Terrace to be exact, on the South Bank. Though she sometimes referred to herself as an, quote, actress, It was pretty understood that she earned her living through sex work, catering to gentlemen in London's West End theatres and clubs. Not on this street level, more of a word-of-mouth thing. She shared the house with several others, including a fellow sex worker and a man named William Hubbard, who lived in the cupboard. No, I'm just kidding. Eliza's lover and protector. Well, Hubbard was actually her first cousin, by the way, and had left his wife years prior to live with Eliza. A frankly scandalous arrangement. Even by the standards of the day, of course, that was even worse. He was known to be jealous and possessive, but their household maintained a certain routine, you see. When Eliza brought clients home late at night, Hubbard would politely go to a separate room, allowing her to entertain the gentlemen visitors in her ground-floor bedroom. This arrangement worked without incident, at least until that fateful night. The evening of May 25th, 1838, Eliza went out as usual to seek clientele among the theatres. She crossed Waterloo Bridge into the Strand, effectively finding herself at the Strand Theatre. Classy. Witnesses later recalled that Eliza met a young, well-dressed man there who spoke English with a foreign, some say French, accent. By all accounts, this client was courteous and appeared respectable, a gentlemanly-looking fellow. Shortly after midnight, Eliza and this unknown man hired a cab and returned south across the river to Wellington Terrace. When they arrived at Eliza's home, the household maid, Mary Fisher, answered the door. In the dim light of the entryway, Mary noticed the gentleman deliberately averted his face, as if not wishing to be recognized. Well, it's probably nothing. Eliza instructed Mary to retire for the night. The maid offered to fetch a candle, but Eliza said it wasn't necessary. She knew where to find the tinder box in the dark. Mary went back to bed, leaving Eliza and the visitor together in the ground-floor bedroom. And so as Mary descended the kitchen stairs, she heard the key turn as the bedroom door was locked from the inside. And then, silence. Nothing more was heard during the night. No cries of pleasure nor of struggle. Around 6 o'clock the next morning, William Hubbard awoke and went to check on Eliza. The details of what he saw upon opening that bedroom door were so ghastly that they would be recounted in newspapers, ballads, and even courtrooms for years to come. Eliza Grimwood lay on the floor in a pool of blood, her nightclothes soaked crimson. Her throat had been slashed so deeply that she was nearly decapitated. Multiple vicious stab wounds covered her chest and abdomen, so ferocious that some likened the scene to a slaughterhouse. Blood spatter coated the walls and the bed, indicating a desperate struggle. Eliza's hands were lacerated with defensive cuts. She had clearly tried to fight her attacker with all of her strength. But the intruder had been merciless. One wound punctured her womb, others her chest. Details that scandalized Victorian sensibilities with their suggestion of a sexual rage or a symbolic brutality. The sheer excess of violence was shocking, and as one report noted, there was so much blood that Hubbard's footsteps were tracked in red through the hall when he ran out screaming for the police. The immediate mystery was the vanished visitor. The door had still been locked when Hubbard forced it open that morning, implying the killer had locked it behind him, likely using Eliza's key, and fled the house by some stealthy means. Perhaps he had crept out a window, or left via the front door earlier without anyone noticing in the pre-dawn darkness. Mary the maid and other lodgers swore they heard nothing unusual overnight. Whoever this French-speaking gentleman was, he had managed to slip away silently, leaving Eliza butchered in that locked room. When the constables of Lambeth Division and an inspector named Charles Field arrived to investigate, they found few solid clues. Not much to go on. Robbery did not appear to be the motive. Eliza's jewellery and valuables in the room were undisturbed. However, the inspector did find that her purse was missing, along with a few inexpensive personal items, and curiously, a ticket for a set of drawers that she had pawned. Perhaps the killer had taken those as tokens, or to make it look like some kind of theft. On the bedside, Inspector Field found a small stack of coins, a few shillings left behind, possibly the agreed payment from the client for her services. The presence of that money suggested that the murderer had paid Eliza, and only afterward turned violent, which is a perplexing scenario. You would expect a dispute over payment or theft to precede such an attack, not follow it. So the two obvious suspects emerged, the mysterious client and William Hubbard himself. Initially, many in the public, and even the police, wondered if Hubbard, the jealous lover, might have killed Eliza in a fit of passion, getting sick of watching all those other men go in and out of the front door, I mean. Well, his behavior upon discovering the body was scrutinized. Hubbard claimed that as he ran outside to summon help, he briefly encountered a man lurking near the house who offered assistance a little too readily. Hubbard insinuated that this stranger could have been the fleeing murderer. Skeptics pointed out that this could be a convenient invention by Hubbard to shift suspicion. It does seem a little convenient, doesn't it? Moreover, a policeman at the scene noted that Hubbard had pocketed the few shillings from the bedside. Pretty odd behavior if those coins were evidence possibly left by the killer. And Hubbard's history, that did him no favors either. It was known he had violently beaten his lawful wife years before, and that he seethed with jealousy over Eliza's interactions with other men. Had he finally snapped? Had he finally had enough? Well, against those suspicions stood a crucial fact, and that was that Hubbard's clothing bore no bloodstains, except on his trousers, likely from kneeling in the gore where he found Eliza. His shirt was completely clean, and given the arterial blood spray and close-quarters savagery of the murder, the perpetrator would have been drenched in blood, right? I mean, the entire room was covered in it. The coroner was convinced that whoever killed Eliza would have been literally covered in the stuff when leaving the scene. Hubbard, whatever his faults, simply did not fit in with that physical evidence. And he had also slept upstairs that night, alongside another lodger, who heard no disturbance until Hubbard's morning alarm. The weight of evidence slowly shifted away from Hubbard and back to the missing visitor. The inquest and ensuing investigation kept London society riveted. Mary Fisher, the maid, described the visitor as best as she could. He was tall, well-dressed. He had a foreign accent. Maybe he was French. Cab drivers were interviewed too. One cabman believed that he had taken up a French-speaking man near the Strand that night. Detectives checked Parisian visitor lists and a French expatriates list in London, but they didn't have any luck. Days passed. Panic grew that a murderer, perhaps a foreign monster, was at large. In the absence of a concrete suspect, a wave of false confessions and wild theories began to roll in. Over the years, several men confessed to the murder, but all turned out to be cranks or liars, attention seekers perhaps. One soldier in the 1840s claimed that he was the one who did it, but he was just saying that so he could get out of his military service. A tale that was quickly debunked. A more intriguing confession came in 1840 from Francois Courvoisier, a Swiss valet awaiting execution for a completely different murder. He had actually killed his boss, Lord William Russell. Courvoisier, perhaps trying to inflate his own notoriety, or maybe unburden his conscience, told Newgate prison officials that he also murdered Eliza Grimwood and another woman in 1837. Courvoisier's confession bore scrutiny. He was indeed a foreigner, and he did have a French accent, and a gentleman's servant matching the vague description of Eliza's client. He had lived in London at the time. Interestingly, he mentioned details of an earlier unsolved stabbing of a prostitute named Eliza Davies in 1837, suggesting that perhaps a serial offender was targeting women named Eliza for some reason. However, Courvoisier's credibility was questionable. He was trying to boast of crimes on the eve of his hanging, and he provided no verifiable details. Some believed him. Inspector Field himself suspected that Eliza's killer had murdered before. Yet Courvoisier soon recanted under pressure from a clergyman, and he went to the gallows without confirming the Grimwood story further. If he had any secrets left to tell, they went to the grave with him in July of 1840. So in the end, despite exhaustive inquiries, no one was ever charged with Eliza Grimwood's murder. The case went cold. It became a staple of Victorian crime annals. Whoever killed Eliza Grimwood was still out there. Well, it haunted the popular imagination, though, that is for sure. Not least Charles Dickens, who was deeply affected by the crime. He was taking a lot of inspiration from everything he saw around him, Dickens, really telling the truth of London, but through a style of fiction. That's why Dickens is so interesting. So while it is fiction works, well, it's kind of true, but the names and places have been changed. Anyway, Dickens was certainly a keen observer of crime reports, and he actually attended some murder scenes with police at the time. And scholars believe that Dickens drew direct inspiration from Eliza's murder when crafting that pivotal scene in Oliver Twist, which was actually published the following year in 1839, so he quickly got onto that one. This is where Bill Sikes savagely beats Nancy to death. Not the most friendly of scenes. Cover the children's eyes in that one. In the novel, Nancy's pleas, the frenzied overkill by Sikes, and even the blood on Sikes' dog's fur, they all have uncanny parallels to the details from Grimwood's case. Dickens' sensational depiction was criticized as excessively horrific. Unaware, readers didn't realize that it was grounded in a very real Victorian murder. You see, Dickens himself would later perform dramatic reenactments of the Sikes and Nancy scene on stage, with such ferocity that friends worried that he was affecting his health. In a morbid twist of fate, Dickens suffered a stroke and died in 1870, and some close to him half-jokingly blamed the strain of repeatedly acting out Nancy's brutal end, as if the ghost of Eliza Grimwood's murder exacted a toll on him. And so, The Grimwood case reveals much about Victorian society's view of crime. Here was a murder of a fallen woman, as the press would euphemistically call a sex worker, that nonetheless drew enormous public sympathy and outrage. Eliza was often portrayed in press accounts as a kind-hearted, tragically fated young woman, rather than blamed for getting involved in the wrong kind of world and sort of inviting her own demise. A somewhat surprising angle, given the era's moral judgments. You think they would just throw that kind of woman to the dogs in those days, but no, they were trying to dress it up as kindly as they could. Perhaps the sheer atrocity of the crime overrode their prejudice. It's hard not to feel sorry for someone who goes through that. But moreover, the case underscored the limits of policing. Inspector Field and his men worked as diligently as they could, but without forensic science or modern communications, an intelligent killer could simply vanish. If he truly was a foreign visitor, he might have left England immediately. Change of clothes, dump them in a barrel somewhere, I don't know, and then just get the first boat across the channel. A lock of Eliza's hair, her scarred face, and the bloody bed sheets remained as a mute evidence in police custody for years, but they yielded no answers. In Victorian parlance, Eliza's murder became a totemic unsolved crime, a grim benchmark against which later horrors were measured. And so to this day, people debate who killed Eliza Grimwood. Was it Hubbard? After all, in a jealous rage that left fewer stains on him than inspected. Kind of unlikely given the evidence. Was it that French stranger, possibly an unstable client who got violent without a clear motive, or even a nascent serial killer who moved on before he could be caught? Some modern writers point out the eerie coincidence that the unknown man angled his face away from the maid, perhaps a deliberate act by someone who was planning murder from the start. We'll probably never have a definitive answer. It's just gone too far now, hasn't it? So Eliza's death remains a mystery. That young woman who crossed Waterloo Bridge, just trying to make a living, only to meet a fate so violent that it shocked an age known for its fascination with the macabre. But it's not the end of the story for crime in London. They would soon see other terrible murders of women. But in 1838, before the serial killer was around as a concept, the Grimwood case stood alone as a nightmare without a conclusion. So let's go 19 years after Eliza Grimwood's murder, and we find another ghastly discovery that proved that unsolved crimes in London were not confined to the killing of women or crimes of passion. Sometimes they emerged literally from the depths of the Thames River. It was October 1857, and early one morning 2 boys were rowing a small boat on the Thames near Waterloo Bridge, where they spotted a dark object caught on one of the bridge's piers. Curiosity led them closer, and soon they realized with horror what they had found. It was a heavy carpet bag, tightly corded and padlocked, from which protruding were human remains. A mangled leg here, a broken arm there. They alerted the river police, and what unfolded became known as the Waterloo Bridge Mystery, an appalling jigsaw puzzle of body parts that baffled the authorities and public alike. When the bag was hauled ashore and opened, it revealed a jumble of mutilated human remains. Inside were portions of a man's torso and limbs, crudely cut up, along with blood-soaked pieces of clothing. This was certainly no medical dissection waste, or anatomical specimen, it was clear that someone had violently murdered someone else and then dismembered the body in an attempt to hide the crime. The Thames, with its tides and mud, had often been used to dispose of unwanted evidence, but rarely in so brazen a manner as stuffing parts of a body into a bag and tossing it off a busy central bridge. The Victorian public was appalled and spellbound. Was this the work of a madman, a surgeon gone wrong, or a fiend using skills learned in the slaughterhouse? The investigation was led by Inspector James Mullins and his men from Scotland Yard. They transported the gruesome bag to a morgue for examination. Medical experts, including police surgeons, carefully laid out the remains. A few key observations emerged in the first case. Well, initially, the victim was male. They could tell that. The parts included portions of a man's trunk and some limbs, though notably, the head was nowhere to be found, as were the hands and feet. The dismemberment had been done with some precision, not the haphazard hacking of a panicked amateur. Cuts appeared to have been made at joints or along anatomical lines, perhaps by someone with knowledge of butchery, or at best anatomy. Initial speculation in the newspapers ran wild. It was on the front cover of every single publication, and some suggested it was a morbid prank by medical students. After all, medical students in London schools did use cadavers for dissection, and there was precedent of students causing mischief with body parts. I mean, practical jokes in university aside, it's it's a little bit too much, that one, I think. But the doctors came along, and they inspected the remains, and after the inspection they quickly ruled this out. You see, the cuts on the bones and flesh did not match professional surgical incisions made during dissection. Instead, they showed signs of being done hastily, and before rigor mortis fully set in, which means that the body was cut up very soon after death, when the limbs were still pliable. And moreover, the remains had been partially boiled and salted, an old method, perhaps, to slow decomposition and prevent any odors. Now that chilling detail suggested that the killer tried to preserve the pieces, possibly to delay discovery or to make handling them less foul. Medical students had no reason to boil cadavers, certainly not to salt them or pepper them. This was certainly foul play, plain and simple. One telling injury was discovered. Amid the remains of the chest, examiners found a single stab wound to the heart. This clean thrust between the victim's ribs was likely the initial cause of death. The absence of disease or other injury on the body parts implied that the person had been healthy until he was violently killed. The torn, blood-stained clothing fragments in the bag hinted at a struggle. The clothes had been ripped, possibly as the victim fought, or as the murderer dragged the body. Yet the killer hadn't stripped the corpse entirely before dismembering it, which is an interesting detail. Many pieces of the body were found still partially clad in clothing. This messy fact led investigators to think that the murderer might have been in a hurry, or less calculated than initially assumed. Well, the foremost question, of course, is who do these limbs belong to? The identity of the victim. And here the investigators hit a brick wall. There was no head, no hands, the classic means of concealing identity in that era. No fingerprints back then, of course, but hands would have had distinctive marks or rings, and the face, of course, is the most identifiable thing. Modern DNA, or even a centralized missing persons bureau, well, they didn't have them either. They had to rely on more basic methods, descriptions and inquiries. The victim appeared to be an adult male of indeterminate age. The boiling had affected skin and tissues. Some clothing scraps were examined for laundry marks or tailor labels, but nothing came up. The newspapers described the find in lurid detail, and London's public flocked to view any accessible evidence. Dozens of people with missing relatives came to the morgue, hoping to identify the remains by scars or clothing. One man thought that the ghastly face, the only facial portion found, was actually a piece of scalp with a part of a face, or in some accounts just a partial face, looked like his missing daughter's features, until he realized that the corpse was male and the age just didn't match. The confusion was understandable, given how disarticulated everything was. It didn't help that the newspapers were just trying to get a good story out. Of course, you got to sell the advertisements in the papers, right? Irresponsible. So amid the frantic hunt for clues, a particular rumor took hold. Could this have been the work of resurrection men or body snatchers playing a prank? Let me explain. By the 1850s, body snatching, that is, stealing corpses for medical dissection, it had mostly dried out, especially after the Anatomy Act of 1832 provided legitimate supplies of cadavers. Moreover, the body snatchers typically stole whole bodies, not carve them up and dump them. Still, some found it easier to believe a ghoulish joke than to face the reality of a diabolical murderer at large. Investigators pursued another angle, the possibility of a Thames boatsman or crew being involved. You see, the Thames was teeming with watermen, bargemen, and sailors. Maybe there was a violent altercation on a ship, and that led to a murder, and the crew panicked and dismembered the victim to dispose of him piecemeal. Or maybe professional butchers or hunters who knew how to cut up carcasses were responsible. The neat joining of some parts hinted at a practiced hand, notably certain cuts, such as the way the pelvis was bisected, would be familiar to hunters who dress large animals, taxidermists, this kind of thing. Police made inquiries at slaughterhouses and among butchers to see if anyone suspicious had been seen, or if a butcher's trade tools were missing. But there was nothing concrete that emerged. Of course, this void of facts was quickly filled with the public's imagination. Penny dreadfuls and broadsides dramatized the mystery of Waterloo Bridge. Some writers dubbed the unknown perpetrator a London thug, comparing him to the strangler assassins of India, or likened the dismemberment to the notorious American case of Dr. Webster, who had dismembered a victim in 1849. Each day, without an answer, fed the legend. In fact, at one point, which was months later, there was a tantalizing twist. News came from far-off India that a British soldier in Lucknow had confessed on his deathbed to murdering a man in London and throwing a bag of remains off Waterloo Bridge. Well, that's got to be it, right? This caused a sensation. Could the mystery be solved from across the globe? The story went that the soldier had participated in the crime in 1857 and fled overseas. However, there's a bit of a problem. Upon investigation, the confession turned out to be unreliable and likely fabricated by someone seeking attention. And the case went back to being unsolved. The official verdict at the inquest was the bland but accurate "found dead," person or persons unknown. The victim himself was never identified, a rare thing in murder cases, which made it much harder to pursue justice. A body without a name is a case without a starting point. Victorian police, lacking forensic means, needed leads like a witness seeing someone with a heavy carpet bag at odd hours, or a report of a missing man in suspicious circumstances. No such lead emerged in 1857, I'm afraid. But in hindsight, the Waterloo Bridge mystery stands as an early example of what we might call a serial killer mentality. Though we don't know if the serial killer struck again, the perpetrator showed cool nerves and grisly ingenuity in handling the body. Some criminologists later note that the idea of spreading body parts around was akin to taunting the authorities, making a puzzle for police to solve. And indeed, in 1873, a very similar strategy would have been seen in another case, the first of the Thames torso series, suggesting that perhaps the concept of hiding evidence by dismemberment, and maybe the very person responsible, persisted into later years. We can't confirm a link, but Victorians themselves, when confronted by the Thames torso murders in 1870s and 80s, recalled the Waterloo Bridge case as a precedent. It's possible the Waterloo murderer got away and lived out an ordinary life by day, carrying that dark secret with him. But for the Victorians of the time, the mystery was deeply unsettling. It implied that a killer, or perhaps multiple killers, might exist who were never caught because they were clever and cold-blooded enough to literally cut their ties to the crime. The case also showed the limitations of mid-century policing. Without systematic morgue photographs, though some photos were taken of the Waterloo victims' remains and preserved, without forensic laboratories, and without coordination between jurisdictions, a murderer's trail could simply evaporate. Investigators came upon what one commentator called the hem of the dark veil, glimpsing a terrible deed, but failing to lift the veil fully to expose the culprit. In cultural terms, the Waterloo Bridge murder contributed to the Victorian obsession with mysterious parcels and severed body parts in fiction and legend. It's even speculated that Robert Louis Stevenson had heard of such dismemberment cases alongside others when he explored the dual nature of a respectable man turned criminal in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde of 1886. Stevenson's tale of a man who hides his violent deeds behind a second identity resonated with the fear that a gentlemanly figure could by night commit atrocities. Much as Eliza Grimwood's killer, or the unknown owner of that carpet bag, might have been outwardly normal by daylight. And so, despite the diligent efforts of the 1857 police force, the Waterloo Bridge mystery remains unsolved to this day. Its victim faceless, nameless. In Battersea's Victorian cemetery, there is said to be a grave of an unknown man murdered and dismembered in 1857, a somber reminder that not all of the dead could tell their tales. And in the Chronicles of London Crime, this case holds a special notoriety, as one of the first times the public truly confronted the idea that a murderer could disappear without a trace, leaving behind only the grisly fragments of his crime. A nightmare scenario. A killer without an identity. A crime without a motive. And a city left to wonder if or when the killer would strike again. Well, let's move on now to a morning of 1872. Christmas Day, actually. Londoners were greeted with a terrifying headline: Santa who has gone missing. I'm just kidding. No, it was a different kind of headline. Murder in Bloomsbury. An actress found with throat cut. Killer at large. That's not the kind of thing you want on Christmas morning. The victim was Miss Harriet Buswell, and her killing occurred in the early hours of Christmas Day. It became one of Victorian London's most sensational unsolved murders. Sometimes called the Great Coram Street murder, after the location of the crime, the case of Harriet Buswell is a chilling blend of mystery and tragedy. But it also serves as a kind of historical bridge between the solitary horror of Eliza Grimwood's murder and the later Whitechapel murders of 1888, with which it shared some uncanny parallels. Indeed, long before anyone had even heard of Jack the Ripper, the name Harriet Buswell was synonymous with an unsolved killer preying on women of the night. So who was she? Well, Harriet Buswell was a 32-year-old woman, just trying to make her way on London's stage, and, when times were lean, through other methods. Originally from a respectable family, some accounts say Herefordshire, she had come to London with theatrical ambitions. She did manage a few minor roles at the Alhambra Theatre in Leicester Square, but true stardom eluded her. By late 1872, Harriet was living in modest rented lodgings at 12 Great Coram Street, Bloomsbury, a somewhat down-at-heel area, not far from the British Museum, actually. She had an 8-year-old daughter from a past relationship, though the child lived elsewhere. Those who knew Harriet described her as personable and good-hearted, a woman trying to keep up appearances despite financial struggles. In the weeks before Christmas, she had pawned many of her belongings to pay rent and debts. Like many women in her situation, she turned to casual prostitution to supplement her income, a dangerous line of work, even in relatively genteel circles such as Bloomsbury. On Christmas Eve, 1872, Harriet set out in the evening with a determined purpose. She hoped to find a gentleman willing to pay for her company, which might help her settle some overdue bills and perhaps provide a bit of holiday cheer for herself and her daughter. She was seen that night at the Alhambra Theatre in Leicester Square, a place she knew well from her acting days. The Alhambra, with its music hall acts and ballets, was also known as a rendezvous spot, where prostitutes mingled with men on the prowl. Sometime around midnight, Harriet encountered a potential client. Witnesses later recalled a German gentleman in her company. This man was described as about 30 years old, of medium height, with a heavy mustache and an air of respectability. He spoke English, but with a German accent. An Alhambra waiter saw them share a drink, and a cab driver reported taking a woman matching Harriet's description and a foreign-looking man from Piccadilly at his Regent Circus toward Bloomsbury in the early hours. By approximately 1 a.m. on Christmas Day, now December 25th, Harriet and this gentleman arrived at her lodging-house in Great Coram Street. Harriet's landlady, Miss Hall, was still awake when Harriet came in. Harriet knocked at the landlady's door and cheerfully paid the 10 shillings she owed for rent, money likely provided by the very man who was accompanying her. Miss Hall glimpsed the gentleman waiting on the stairs. She noted he was well dressed, carrying a small parcel. Some said a bundle of fruits and nuts, which Harriet had perhaps bought or had been given by the man as a treat, and indeed looked foreign, possibly German. Harriet explained that this was a friend, seeing her from the theatre. After paying her rent, Harriet wished her landlady a good night and went upstairs with the man to her room on the first floor. Not long after, Other residents in the house heard the sound of a door locking. It was apparently Harriet's door. Likely she turned the key to ensure privacy, a common practice for security, especially if entertaining a client. But that would be the last time that anyone would see Harriet alive. Around 6:30 a.m. on Christmas morning, some neighbors later reported hearing the sound of footsteps coming hastily down from the stairs from Harriet's room, and the front door opening and closing. They assumed it was Harriet's gentleman caller departing. Nothing seemed amiss at that moment. Leaving in the morning, it's pretty normal. It was not unusual for an overnight guest to do that in a discreet fashion. However, as the morning wore on, Harriet did not emerge. By midday, Miss Hall became concerned. Harriet was usually up at that time, and they were supposed to share a bit of a Christmas meal. Receiving no response from knocking, the landlady grew alarmed and fetched help to force the door. It was found to be locked, with the key missing. They managed to pry it open, and inside they confronted a blood-curdling scene. Harriet Buswell lay on the bed, face up, dead in a lake of blood. Her throat had been slashed deeply, twice, a brutal double cut from ear to ear. Blood saturated the bedclothes, and it even dripped onto the floor. The medical examiner later noted that one of the gashes almost decapitated her, cutting through the windpipe and carotid artery. Despite the ferocity of the wounds, Harriet's face was oddly at peace. Some witnesses commented that she looked as if she might be sleeping, were it not for the gore. It was as if death had come upon her so swiftly that she hadn't time to register the horror. There were a few signs of struggle, blood spots in parts of the room, and on her hands small cuts, as if she had thrown them up defensively. The bed and pillows had impressions that suggested two people had lain there, which fit the story of her having a male companion. Notably, the murderer had locked the door from the outside when he left and took the key. This explained why Harriet hadn't been found sooner. No one expected anything was wrong behind the locked door, until she failed to appear hours later. Police from the Metropolitan Force arrived promptly and began their inquiry. Inspector Henry Mulvaney took charge of this case. Clues? Not much to be found. Scarce, if anything. But a few items were immediately noted. The room had been rifled up in a minor way. Harriet's small jewelry box was open and a cheap brooch or two were missing. Her purse was gone. A parcel of fruit and nuts she had brought home, perhaps a festive gift from the client, was also not found. These missing items indicated that the killer had stolen a few belongings. However, valuable things, like a watch on the mantel and money Harriet had paid the rent with, they were still in the room, and this suggested that the motive might not have been a simple robbery. Or if it was, the thief/killer was oddly selective. Perhaps the theft was staged to mislead, or perhaps the assailant grabbed only what he easily saw, and the adrenaline of the whole situation made things kind of difficult to plan out. Crucially, there was that description of the German gentleman. In fact, two witnesses came forward to bolster the story. One was the waiter from the Alhambra, who recalled the man's foreign accent. Another was a local grocer, who had sold some oranges and nuts late at night to a man and woman, believed to be Harriet and her companion on their way home. This grocer later positively identified the suspect as the same man, a key part of the unfolding investigation. When a German suspect was in mind, detectives canvassed the German expatriate community and ships in port. In a dramatic turn, the search led them to the port of London, where a German sailing vessel named Wangerland was docked, preparing to depart for the continent. On board was a German reverend, Dr. Gottfried Heinrich Hessel, the ship's captain. Dr. Hessel matched the rough description. He was in his early 30s. He was of medium build, and he had a mustache. Importantly, he had been away from his lodgings in Ramsgate on Christmas Eve, telling his wife he went to London for the day. He returned on Christmas Day looking somewhat dishevelled. Even more damning, a chambermaid at Hessel's hotel in Ramsgate reported that on December 28th, 3 days after the murder, Dr. Hessel gave her several blood-stained handkerchiefs to wash and asked for turpentine and a brush, claiming he had gotten paint on some clothes. Well, blood or paint. Either way, it's suspicious timing. Word of this got to the police. By New Year's, the police had zeroed in on Dr. Hessel as their prime suspect. They detained him and arranged a police lineup at Bow Street for identification. The Alhambra waiter and the grocer were asked to pick out the man they had seen with Harriet. In the dramatic fashion of the day, Hessel was paraded among several other individuals, and both witnesses indicated Hessel as the man in question. That was enough for authorities to charge him, and in January of 1873, Dr. Hessel was formally accused of Harriet Buswell's murder. Well, the press, they had a field day. A respectable clergyman implicated in a heinous killing. Now that's a story. German diplomats and Hessel's friends protested his innocence. Hessel himself maintained a calm, perhaps arrogant demeanor, vehemently denying that he had ever met the victim. The case against Hessel, while tantalizing, soon began to unravel under scrutiny. First, his alibi. Multiple people from the hotel in Ramsgate, including the owner and a family friend, swore that Dr. Hessel was present at the hotel on the night of December 24th. Their accounts claimed Hessel had been ill with bronchitis and was in no condition to gallivant in London. One friend testified that he had played cards with Hessel that evening. And the key piece, the boots alibi, was peculiar but persuasive to Victorian minds. You see, at the hotel, Hessel's boots had been left outside his door overnight, a common practice for staff to polish them. Other guests said that they noticed the boots in the hallway throughout the night, implying Hessel hadn't left the premises. Of course, as was later noted, nothing prevented a man from owning 2 pairs of boots. But at the same time, this detail impressed the magistrates as evidence that Hessel couldn't have snuck off to London and back. The bloodied handkerchiefs? Hessel explained that easily. His wife had brushed against wet red paint at the hotel construction site, staining her dress, and he used turpentine and cloths to clean it, hence the red blood stains. Well, blood-like stains. And here's the thing, too, the hotel maid actually corroborated part of this, albeit the exact nature of the stains remains ambiguous. Meanwhile, Hessel did admit that he had gone to London earlier on Christmas Eve day for some shopping and errands, but claimed he returned to Ramsgate by late afternoon. If true, that put him out of London well before Harriet met her killer that night. Railway records and witnesses testify about train times being muddled, but Hessel's defense managed to create doubt that he could physically have been in London at the murder hour. The prosecution's case collapsed for lack of direct evidence. The identifications by the waiter and the grocer, while earnest, were just not ironclad proof. Cross-examination raised questions about visibility and the certainty of recognizing a stranger seen briefly under gaslight. Moreover, Harriet's landlady, Miss Hall, when asked, could not positively identify Hessel as the man on the stairs. She hadn't gotten a clear look of his face. And there were also the lack of any of Harriet's stolen items in Hessel's possession. If he were the thief-murderer, he hadn't kept the purse or jewellery. Though a cunning man might have tossed them, I suppose. After a few tense weeks of investigation and a public inquest, followed by magistrates' hearings, the authorities released Dr. Hessel for want of evidence. He was never brought to a full trial. The press, which had initially lauded the police for a swift arrest, now turned on them for accusing an apparently upstanding foreign clergyman. Victorian society, with some undercurrent of xenophobia, had been quick to believe that a foreign ogre was the real culprit. Now, faced with Hessel's acquittal, newspapers lamented the mystery and criticized the police for failing to solve it. As for Dr. Hessel, well, he very quickly got out of England. Reputation stained, but himself a free man. And with Hessel's release, the great Coram Street murder case went cold. No other suspect was ever charged. The mystery man with the German accent vanished as completely as if he were a phantom. Harriet Buswell's murder joined the annals of unsolved Victorian London crimes. But London's population did not forget it. In the years to follow, Harriet's name would crop up whenever unsolved murders of women occurred. Some speculated, wildly, that Harriet Buswell might have been an early victim of Jack the Ripper. The Ripper, of course, killed in 1888, 16 years later. One or two theories have suggested that the Ripper could have begun killing in the 1870s, gone dormant, and then resumed. But this theory finds little support among historians. The differences in method — Harriet was killed indoors, throat cut but not mutilated, and items stolen — make it unlikely that it was the same hand. More plausibly, Harriet's case influenced Victorian expectations. By 1888, older folk would recall that not every prostitute murder was solved, and that a killer could slip away, context often lost in our modern fixation on the Ripper as an isolated phenomenon. So what can we glean from Harriet Buswell's sad fate? Well, the case showed the limitations of police work, even in the more and more organized metropolitan police of the 1870s. Detectives did their best with interviews and lineups, but without forensic science or surveillance, a cunning murderer could leave scarcely a trace. It is entirely possible, too, that Harriet's killer was indeed a visiting foreign national, whether Hessel or another, who hopped on a ship or train and left England within a day or two, escaping justice forever. It's also possible that he was a London-based man, who simply never aroused suspicion thereafter. We know that Harriet had been seen conversing with multiple men at that night. Could the killer have even been someone else she knew and not the German stranger? And here's one intriguing footnote. Harriet sometimes used the alias Clara or Clara Burton. In police files, letters poured in with theories. At least one letter suggested an English admirer might have killed her out of jealousy, learning she had another client. But these were unsubstantiated musings. Victorian commentators drew a moral from Harold's story about the dangers that women faced and the cunning of evildoers. A former Scotland Yard officer, Sir Arthur Griffiths, wrote in the 1890s that many at the Yard still believed Dr. Hessel was the culprit, and that he narrowly escaped conviction due to an unimpeachable alibi, in their view too hastily accepted. True or not, it shows that even in the decades later, professionals were debating the case. And the fact remains that the murder of Harriet was never identified. And we reach the end of our unsolved murders of Victorian London. Maybe I'll do a part 2. Do you want me to do a part 2? All right, fine, I'll do it. We'll get onto it soon enough, okay? But for now, this is the time where we thank our top-tier patrons and supporters, keeping everything ad-free. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Gary, Katie B., Lovely, Poma, Kevin, Marissa, Altazakin, Lucy, Julianne, Rosie, Tivolo, Chris, Apocalyptic, Brandy, Wolfsbane, Dude, Brinny, Aiden, Fabian, Michael, Agworm, Prince of Persia, River, Indian Trail, Catherine, Alexa, Big Gun 101, Brandy, Bestie Hun, Stevie, Jessica, Scott, Gail, Emily, Jake, Jade, Demons, Toe, Mason, John, and Magenta. Thank you so much. And tell me what you thought in the comments, Who is your favorite psychotic murderer, Well, that's enough from me tonight. Have a good rest. Keep yourself safe. Lots of love to you all around the world, and farewell for now.